Hey, happy Monday. It's the day after Easter, but as I had mentioned in our first Monday session together for April, we were going to talk about Easter even the day after. There's a couple of books that we hand out at Oakridge Community Church at Easter season that we encourage people to take and read through them. They're short, but then pass them to other people who might have questions about Christianity. One is entitled The Resurrection in You by Josh and Sean McDowell, father and son, and the other is The Case for Easter by Lee Strobel. Now, the reason why we give these books out is that when Easter season rolls around, almost without exception, every year some of the same old, shall I say, theories and questions arise about whether Jesus really rose from the dead or not. The bottom line is, if I struggle with the idea that Jesus could rise from the dead, in reality I'm struggling with the idea that there is a God who could perform miracles. Because the resurrection of Christ is a miracle. There's no doubt about that. Over the years, a number of theories have been put forth by people to try to explain away the resurrection. I know of several. This morning, or in this video, we're going to look at one theory that comes to mind regarding this whole idea of the resurrection of Christ. It's not one of the more well-known theories. You don't hear about it often, but occasionally it pops its head back up out of the sand, and people grab a hold of it and use this to try to disprove the resurrection of Jesus. This theory has gone by different names. It's known as the swoon theory by many people. It's the idea that Jesus did not really die on the cross. In fact, when he was taken down from the cross and put in the empty tomb, because of the conditions of the tomb, the dampness and other things, Jesus somehow was able to revive himself. And then from there, all kinds of things supposedly happened. So I want to deal with this theory. Did Jesus really die? What about him being buried in a tomb? Was there any evidence that even tells us about the events and everything that took place around the death of Christ and his resurrection? Well, let me begin with this. The Roman soldiers, who were experts at crucifixion, said that Jesus was dead. In John chapter 20, we read those very words. Usually when people were crucified on a cross, they could literally hang there for days until finally they died. But to hasten the death of the two criminals that were hung on each side of Jesus and of Jesus himself, because it was Passover and the Jews didn't want any bodies hanging on a cross during the Passover time, the Romans went to the thieves, saw that they were still alive, and then broke their legs so they could no longer push themselves up to breathe, and eventually they suffocated. But when they came to Jesus' body, these men, who sadly were experts at this hideous form of death, saw clearly that Jesus was dead. They took a spear, stabbed it in his side, but there was no doubt that Christ was dead. Remember, they had nailed his feet and his hands to the cross, so there was tremendous shock to the body. There was massive blood loss. But even before he was crucified, the Bible tells us in John 19 that the Roman soldiers gave Christ a severe beating. The Romans were experts at using these whips, they were instruments of torture. And when they beat a person with their whips, which sometimes were leather that had pieces of stone and glass in them, when they hit the body of an individual, they would literally cut a person's back to ribbons, and sometimes even, and this is very graphic, but it's true, internal organs could be seen. So Jesus was beaten, and so he suffered a tremendous amount of loss of blood during the beatings. In some cases, people that were beaten by the Romans had a hard time making it even to the crucifixion. And the crucifixion was usually in Rome. If you're a Roman citizen, you couldn't be crucified, but it was usually for the worst of the worst criminals. And this innocent Son of God is nailed to a cross between two thieves. And that just in itself, that graphic picture of the Lamb of God being crucified is almost overwhelming. But he's crucified. The soldier said he's dead. He was beaten before that. And then after he was taken off the cross, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus took his body, wrapped his body in linens for burial, and then put ointments and spices on the body as a preservative, as an embalming method of the first century before they laid him in the tomb. It's been estimated that by the time you got done embalming a person in the first century with all the spices and ointments and wrappings, you would have an additional 50, 60, 70 pounds that are compressed against the body. So Christ has been crucified. He was beaten before that even happened, and now he's wrapped up in this tomb. And so he's buried. A stone weighing several hundred pounds is rolled in front of the grave to keep out grave robbers and animals. And a fourth and very important point in all of this is that Matthew 27 tells us that the religious leaders were so paranoid about things that Jesus said about rising from the dead that they went to Pontius Pilate and they asked for a Roman guard to be put at the tomb. More than likely, there were 16 highly trained Roman soldiers that were put on duty to guard the tomb to make sure the disciples didn't steal the body, that no one would tamper with what had just happened, the events of the death and burial of Christ. It was also sealed. And when they sealed something in the ancient world, for example, the tomb, they would take a piece of string, a thick string, and they would wrap it or attach it to the front of the stone. And in the middle of this string, they would take some clay, hot wax or clay, and then they would impress the insignia of the local Roman authority into this wax. And so you were not allowed to break a seal that had a Roman emperor's, ring in it or anything like that, unless you were given the authority to do so. If you broke a seal that you didn't have the authority to break, you could be put to death. All of this is for the sole purpose of keeping Jesus in the grave. So what about this theory that he never died? That somehow he was miraculously revived in the tomb? Well, what do you say in response to that? Well, let me share a few things. One, the experts said he was dead. The Roman soldiers said he was dead. Jesus said that he would die, be buried, and rise again. If that's not the case, he's a liar. There's no reason to think that he would do that he would lie. Second, I'm somehow supposed to believe that after Jesus has been beaten and crucified, losing a great amount of blood, that somehow he's able to revive himself in the tomb, roll away this massive hundreds of pound stone, and then barehanded in kung fu style or whatever, take on the Roman soldiers, 16 guards probably, and subdued them barehanded, and then walked for many miles on damaged, injured feet and proclaimed to be the Messiah. Come on. It takes more faith to believe that than to believe in the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. I would encourage each one of us, even today, the day after Easter, that we pay close attention to the details of the events surrounding Easter And we will come to the conclusion that is historically provable. Jesus rose from the dead. Today, he offers salvation to all who come by faith seeking it. I want to encourage you to have a great week. And just to encourage you in this, every theory that has ever been put forth to try to disprove the resurrection has been answered many, many times. Jesus is risen. That's Easter. Hey, have a great week. This is Scott from Oakridge Community Church.